They thought it was the end. The truck stopped in the worst possible place. Not near buildings, not near the camp gates, but in the open, where the land stretched flat and empty in every direction, and the sky felt too large to offer protection. The engines died. Silence followed, heavy, unnatural, broken only by the sound of dust settling. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then the order came. 5 men climbed down slowly, joints stiff, muscles aching from hours of sitting. Their boots hit the ground, almost in unison. The earth was dry and pale, unfamiliar underfoot. Australia, a place that still felt theoretical, like something described rather than lived. Ahead of them, barbed wire cut the landscape into rigid lines. Behind it, nothing that looked like a camp. No barracks, no watchtowers close enough to explain the stop. Only guards. Their spacing was deliberate. Their posture was wrong. This was not routine. These men had learned routine well. They had learned how to move without drawing attention, how to work without complaint, how to survive by becoming unremarkable. Captivity had taught them that standing out was dangerous. But here, routine vanished. One guard stepped forward. A rifle came up, not lifted casually, not swung as a threat, aimed. Time thinned until it felt fragile. No one looked at the rifle directly. Eyes fixed forward, bodies rigid. Training held them in place, even as instinct demanded movement. One man felt his heartbeat in his throat and wondered if it would betray him. Another thought, absurdly, of the smell of bread from a bakery he had known as a boy. A third noticed how bright the sky was and realized he might never see it again. Fear did not explode. It condensed. Nothing happened. The rifle lowered. Orders followed, clipped, impatient, ordinary. They were told to move. The men obeyed without hesitation, muscles releasing tension only after their backs were turned. They did not speak. They did not need to. Something had changed. The camp they were taken to afterward felt different, not visibly harsher, not openly cruel, but tighter. Workdays grew longer. Supervision increased. Guards watched more closely, spoke less. Small mistakes were corrected immediately, without explanation. Conversations ended abruptly when uniforms approached. The rifle incident was never acknowledged, but it existed everywhere. In the way the men stood straighter, in the way hands remained visible, in the way no one asked unnecessary questions anymore. Fear became background noise. Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries, days blurred together. Work under the sun stripped thought down to essentials, clearing land, repairing fences, carrying stones that seemed heavier than they should be. Sweat-soaked clothes within minutes. Water was precious. Shade was rare. At night, exhaustion should have brought sleep. Instead, it brought memory. The sound of boots, the angle of the rifle, the moment where everything could have ended without reason. They lay awake, staring at darkness, listening for footsteps that sometimes never came. Letters arrived sporadically. Each one felt like an artifact from another world. Cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, food shortages everywhere. Germany no longer sounded like a place waiting to receive them. It sounded like something broken, something uncertain, something that demanded explanation. Australia, for all its fences and warnings, felt stable, predictable, unchanged. This realization disturbed them more than comforted them. One evening, sitting near the barracks, one man finally broke the silence. "Do you think they meant it?" he asked quietly. No one asked him to clarify. Another man shrugged slightly. It doesn't matter. That's not an answer. No, the second man said. It's worse. They fell silent again. Some questions had no safe answers. When news of the war's end arrived, it did not bring celebration. It brought calculation. Repatriation would come. Ships would leave. Choices would be demanded. Some men spoke eagerly about home, clinging to the idea of return as if repetition could make it solid again. Others said nothing. They remembered the dust, the raised rifle, the understanding that death did not require drama. Home, they realized, could be just as dangerous. As time passed, restrictions loosened, guards relaxed. The war faded into official history, but the moment in the dust never faded. It shaped how the men moved through the world afterward. When permission came to stay, some accepted without hesitation. Others agonized. A few refused to decide at all, letting time decide for them. Those who stayed did not feel victorious. They felt continued. Life did not reset. It extended. They worked, learned English slowly, watched the land change with seasons they had never known before. The wire disappeared. The sky remained. Years later, when people ask why they stayed, the answers were careful. They spoke of opportunity, of work, of stability. They did not speak of rifles. They did not speak of dust. But every one of them remembered the moment they believed it was the end, and realized afterward that survival does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it gives you another day. And sometimes the place where you survive becomes the place where you choose to live. After the lists were posted and the decisions made, the camp did not change overnight. It dissolved slowly. Barbed wire was removed, section by section, not all at once. Watchtowers remained standing long after they stopped being used, empty silhouettes against the sky. The guards still walked their routes out of habit, even when there was no one left to guard. For the men who chose to stay, this in-between period was the hardest. They were no longer prisoners, but they were not yet free in the way people imagined freedom. Learning a new kind of fear. Outside the camp, the world felt exposed. There were no fences to define space, no schedules imposed from above, no clear rules beyond work contracts and basic laws they barely understood. Freedom brought choice. Choice brought responsibility. For years, decisions had been made for them. Now, every step carried weight. Where to work, where to live, who to speak to, what version of themselves to present. Some nights, this frightened them more than captivity ever had. At least captivity had boundaries. Work as structure. They gravitated toward labor instinctively. Farms first, then railways, then construction sites, expanding alongside growing towns. Australia was rebuilding, not from ruins, but toward expansion, and it needed hands more than questions. The men worked quietly. They arrived early. They stayed late. They did not argue. Supervisors noticed. Trust followed slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. Work gave them structure where ideology once had. The ghost of the rifle, the moment in the dust, never disappeared. It changed shape. Sometimes it returned as a sudden tightening in the chest when someone raised their voice. Sometimes as a sharp awareness of hands, of posture, of exits. Sometimes as a dream. Always the same image, never the sound. A rifle lifted, time stretched, then nothing. They learned to live around it. They did not call it trauma. That word did not belong to their generation. They called it memory, or simply that day. but it influenced everything. They avoided unnecessary confrontation. They respected authority without trusting it blindly. They understood how quickly normality could fracture. Distance from Germany, letters from Europe grew less frequent. Some families rebuilt, others vanished into silence. Political divisions hardened. Germany redefined itself in ways the men struggled to recognize from afar. The longer they stayed, the less they felt pulled back, not because they forgot, but because memory without place becomes weight, not direction. Australia did not ask them to explain who they had been. It only asked what they could do next. Language and identity. English came slowly. They learned it through repetition, not classrooms, through work orders, through mistakes, through embarrassment. Accents remained heavy, grammar imperfect, but communication became possible. Some altered their names to make life easier. Others refused, accepting the distance it created. Both choices were acts of survival. Identity became flexible, not erased, not denied, adjusted. Relationships, friendships formed cautiously. Australians were practical. Suspicion existed, but it softened in the face of consistency. A man who worked hard and caused no trouble became part of the landscape. Romantic relationships were more complicated. Some locals could not separate the man from the uniform he once wore. Others could. Marriages happened quietly. Children followed. For those children, the war existed as silence more than story, an accent, a habit, a pause before answering certain questions. Aging with memory. Years passed. The men grew older without realizing it at first. Hair thinned, backs stiffened, hands bore the marks of decades of labor. Australia changed around them. Towns grew, roads stretched, generations shifted. The rifle moment aged with them. What once felt like fear became perspective. They understood how close they had come to non-existence and how arbitrary survival had been. This understanding made them patient, sometimes distant, often introspective. They did not waste energy on outrage. They had already stood at the edge once, looking back, not returning. Some of them visited Germany decades later. They walked through rebuilt cities that felt unfamiliar. They searched for addresses that no longer existed. Graves replaced houses. New generations spoke a different language of memory. They returned to Australia with clarity. Germany was origin. Australia was consequence. They stayed where consequence lived. The final years. In old age, the men spoke more openly, but selectively. They told stories about work, about heat, about mistakes made while learning a new country. They rarely spoke about the war directly, but sometimes, late in the evening, after trust had settled into the room, one of them would mention that day, not dramatically, just as a fact. "We thought it was over," someone would say, and that was enough. Endings without closure. They died quietly, one in a hospital bed, one on a farm he had worked for 30 years, one in a small house at the edge of town. The gravestones carried German names under Australian skies. No medals, no speeches, no controversy. Just lives fully lived after a moment that should have ended them. History would never record their fear. It would record policies, migration numbers, camp locations, but not 5 men standing in dust, facing a raised rifle, realizing that survival can arrive without warning, and that what comes after survival can last a lifetime. They thought it was the end. It wasn't. It was the beginning of everything that followed. In the end, the memories did not return as nightmares. They returned as questions. The men were old now, not suddenly, not dramatically, simply old in the way that creeps up quietly, measured by slower mornings and longer pauses between movements. Their hands still remembered work. Their bodies still carried habits shaped by decades of labor under an open sky. But their minds had more room than before, and memory fills empty space easily. When the past begins to speak, for years, silence had been a shield. They had built lives sturdy enough to hold it. Jobs, families, routines. The past was contained, folded neatly into places that did not interfere with the present. But as responsibilities faded, memory began to surface without invitation. A sound, a posture, the angle of light across dry ground. The rifle moment returned, not with fear, but with detail. They remembered things they hadn't noticed at the time. The dust on boots, the way the guard's breath fogged briefly in the heat, the exact second when time seemed to hesitate. They realized something unsettling. They had survived not because someone spared them, but because someone chose not to act. Speaking at last, some of them began to talk, not publicly, not dramatically, just enough. A question from a grandchild, a conversation with a historian, a quiet moment with someone who listened without trying to judge. They spoke carefully, avoiding justification or condemnation. They did not ask for understanding. They offered context. They described captivity without exaggeration. They described fear without spectacle. They described choice as something small and ordinary, often made under pressure, without certainty. When they spoke about that day, they never called it a threat. They called it a lesson, the meaning of survival. What troubled them most in old age was not what almost happened. It was what followed. They understood now that survival had not ended in the camp. It had extended into decades of decisions: whom to trust, where to stay, when to speak, when to remain silent. The rifle had taught them something that no ideology ever had, that life does not owe you explanation, and that continuation is not guaranteed. This knowledge had shaped them quietly, making them cautious but resilient, reserved but observant. They were not bitter. They were precise. Legacy without instruction. Their children and grandchildren grew up Australian in every way that mattered. The past existed as fragments, sometimes shared, often withheld. The older men did not try to teach lessons explicitly. They taught by example, by patience, by restraint, by an understanding that certainty is fragile. When asked why they never returned permanently to Germany, the answers were simpler now. Because I finished something here. Because I survived here. Because this is where my life continued. The final understanding. In their final years, one of them wrote a short note. Not a memoir, not a confession, just a sentence. We believed it was the end. It wasn't. And that changed everything. The note was never published. It didn't need to be. What remains? They passed away one by one. Quiet deaths, ordinary funerals, graves that blended into the land. History would not pause for them. But something endured. The understanding that survival is not a moment. It is a process. That fear can sharpen clarity. That the place where you face the end can become the place where you begin again. They thought it was the end. It never was. It was the moment that taught them how to live afterward. Closing thought. Idealne dla finalnej oзвучки. Most wars end with borders and treaties. Some end with silence, and a few end with people who walk away, not victorious, not defeated, but changed enough to choose a different life. Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.